I think my understanding of 1981 riots, simply because I wasn't born at the time, largely comes from working with the collection at the Black Cultural Archives. I previously used to work at the Black Cultural Archives, and that was a collection that I was developing at the time. So I worked in the oral histories, and I've worked around the riots that happened in 1981. And I think from that, the fundamental theme that came out of that was policing, particularly racism in policing. If I'm going to cut slightly to 2011, I worked for The Guardian, and we did a piece of research with the London School of Economics into the riots across the entire nation. And we looked, I didn't say we looked specifically at Brixton, but we did speak to people from the area who participated in that. And I think that was more varied. There was themes about policing, but there was themes about general inequality or perceptions of inequality and injustice that existed between the state, your elites, politicians, big business, and your ordinary person, your ordinary young person. A feeling that, there was an anger that caught fire previously in Tottenham, and so it almost felt like there was some kind of, some kind of wave that people felt, well, let's go and express ourselves too. Let's go continue what we saw happen in Tottenham. And there was a sense that people felt that they could basically feel empowered to go out into the streets, and depending on your perspective of how you feel power should be executed, whether destroying your own community constitutes real empowerment is another thing. But from the people that we spoke to in the interviews that were conducted, people feeling, first of all, disempowered by the status quo, felt that time brought the opportunity to actually go out and feel empowered and basically take their own back against the state and everybody who that embodied. What was the role of young people during the riots? I think the danger of focusing on young people in the riots is that you isolated just the young people. Of course, we know that there was a broad spectrum of people involved. And furthermore, I think a lot of the people who did get involved, I think that they were from communities who've had specific issues with the police, which means that if you focus on youth, you miss the connection with the elders. So many people who were out on the streets, their family were out on the streets in 1980. I remember one specific case in Liverpool where people said, my mum told me about being a part of Toxteth riots. I wanted to be a part of these riots. My family have been heralded by the police continually. I remember one of the first people to be arrested in Tottenham, his mother was a very famous case of police brutality. And so there is actually a community link there. And if you focus just on the youth, you might miss that. Of course, young people were disproportionately involved. And a large part of the feedback that I've heard is largely due to the fact that many of the people involved felt over-policed. And of course, I think personally, my opinion is that young people are in an interesting space where in this current climate, I don't think you've seen greater assaults on what young people have, opportunities, employment. And I feel that in amongst being, young and not really having maybe particular responsibilities, people felt that, we're angry and we can express ourselves because we've got nothing else to lose. But I guess that's a good question for somebody younger than myself, maybe such as yourself. With the 1980 riots, my familiarity comes through working with the collection at the BCA and developing that collection. And developing collections slightly different from maybe, pure primary or secondary research in that sense. I would say that I'm an informal researcher in that sense because obviously I'm going through the collection, I'm engaging with it. But because I'm not actually putting out published material, you can't really call me a researcher into the 1980 riots, even though I would say I know quite a bit about it myself. My thoughts of it is simply that the 1980s were a time of real division, real conflict, real inequality. I'm tempted to draw academic parallels between what is happening then and what is happening now. I see clear similarities, but I didn't live in the 1980s then. And certainly hearing the stories, even in the archive, from Alex Wheatle, from family, from friends, I see that as being a slightly different experience, even though many of the things that happened then are happening now. The 1980 riots, I think, clearly a backlash against racism, clearly a backlash against inequality, Thatcherism. the fact that, you know, police had impunity and they were given that level of impunity. I think we've seen from Leveson, we've seen from McPherson, we've seen from, let's say from Scarman, but it's kind of hinted in Scarman, the fact that at that time, you know, the elites, the establishment, the police, they were really in cahoots. And in terms of youths from Brixton, from Tottenham, from Derry in Ireland, they were really seen as the enemy. And they were openly attacked. And they were openly given license to attack them because they were seen as, you know what I mean, they were seen almost an enemy within. And I think even if you draw some of the famous speeches, Thatcher saying that we feel swamped by these, you know, Caribbean migrants and Asian migrants that have come into the country, and the fact that Enoch Powell's speech earlier talking about rivers of blood, and that was almost seen as a definitive text by some of the far-right groups that would come into communities, and, you know, many of the far-right, you know, had infiltrated the police. You know, I remember there's a famous segment on somebody recalling their time as a police officer in the 1980s, saying, I wasn't a racist when I joined the police force, but by the time I left, I was definitely a racist. And I think, you know, the 1980s was a really volatile and violent and unequal time. And so for me, the riots of that time were pretty much an expression of that. I don't know if there's any differences. Research will say that they were different. Research will say that there was a clearer narrative in the 1980s. Britain was racist, Britain was unfair, police were violent, people backlashed against it. And they will say 2011 was far more convoluted, it was far more diverse, you know, it was more complex, they'll say. I think some of the root issues very much were prevalent in 2011, and also I'm someone who draws a lineage between the two, and I say, well, hang on, what we see is it's the same communities from 1980s who are again involved in 2011. Like I mentioned previously, one of the first people to be arrested in Tottenham, his mother died in a famous case of police brutality. You know, these are people who had a very long experience of the police, if not them personally, but certainly their families. So that history is very relevant. People say, again, 2011, there was far more violence and less protests. So there was more looting in that sense. But then people forget, you know, Brixton, there was crazy looting happening in Brixton. Somebody I know who was involved said to me, I remember being chased by the police, and in one hand I had a little portable TV, and in another hand I had a stereo. And I'd been chased by the police, and it really hurt me, but I had to let one of them go, and I didn't know which one to let go. So I had to let go of the television because I love music, and then I got away. And they were telling me about the opportunism in the leather jacket stores and things like that. And so I know that looting was a part of the 1980 riots. I know that for a fact. But of course, the way that history is then retold, it's told in a way to take away the politics. So that was real, this isn't real. That way you don't have to deal with the issues. But in terms of giving you a conclusive answer as to what were the fundamental differences, I think more research needs to be done in that sense.